Hi guys, welcome to Bedtime Sleepy, where history settles in quietly beside you. The summer of 1816 never came, not in the way anyone expected, not in the way any living American had ever seen or would ever see again in their lifetimes. The planting season arrived on schedule, because calendars don't care what the sky's doing. May came, June came, the almanac said what they always said. But the ground stayed locked in something cold and wrong, something that didn't belong to any season anyone could name. Farmers from the coast of Maine to the hills of Virginia watched their corn seedlings curl at the edges and go dark. They watched frost crystals form on the surfaces of ponds in June, actual ice cracking at the margins in the middle of what should have been early summer. They watched a sky that refused to turn the right shade of blue, a sun that cast shadows but gave no warmth, a horizon that stayed pale and thin and quietly wrong. This wasn't a bad week. It wasn't a late cold snap. It wasn't the kind of spring freeze a farmer could shake off and plant around. This was the entire summer gone. Every month from May through October of 1816 brought temperatures so far outside the range of normal that the people recording them sometimes wrote question marks beside their own numbers, as if they suspected their thermometers were lying. Snow fell in New England in June, not a dusting, not a flurry. Heavy snow across multiple states, in a month when children should have been running barefoot through warm grass. July temperatures in Vermont and New Hampshire dropped below freezing. Hard freeze, killing freeze, the kind of cold that splits green wood and destroys everything that's been planted in open ground. By August, farmers who had already replanted their fields twice were watching their third crop blacken before it could mature, standing in the rows with their hands at their sides with nowhere left to turn. The men and women who had staked their survival on what the ground would give them found themselves facing something that had no name and no precedent. They'd planned for late frosts, they'd planned for drought, they'd planned for flooding and pests and poor soil. They hadn't planned for this. Nobody had. Nobody could have. 1800 and froze to death. That's what they called it. Not in any official document, not in any government report, but in the ledgers and the letters and the scratched diary entries of ordinary people trying to make sense of something that refused to make sense. 1800 and froze to death. 7 words. Inside them, the entire weight of a generation's experience. The crop failures, the hunger, the livestock dying in their stalls in August. The families who packed everything they owned into wagons and drove west because there was nothing left to stay for. The largest single-year internal migration in American history up to that point, triggered not by war or policy, but by the complete and inexplicable disappearance of an entire summer. You've heard of the Dust Bowl. You've heard of the blizzard of 1888, the Great Mississippi Flood, the droughts that scorched the plains. But the year without a summer has been quietly erased from American memory, filed away in obscure meteorological archives, footnoted in agricultural histories, almost never taught in schools, almost never discussed the way other national disasters are discussed. And that erasure matters, because what happened in 1816 didn't just reshape one region, it reshaped the whole architecture of American settlement, the direction of American politics, and the inner life of a generation of ordinary people who'd been promised that the land would provide, and watched that promise fall apart under a sky that had gone somehow wrong. If you're settling in for this one tonight, late, maybe a little tired, wanting something that'll pull you somewhere interesting and leave you thinking, go ahead and get comfortable. This is a long story, and it deserves to be told slowly. If you drift off before the end, it'll still be here when you come back. And if you find yourself wanting more stories like this one, there's a subscribe button nearby that costs you nothing and means a great deal. Stories this old deserve an audience. Now, back to 1816. Up at Monticello in the hills above Charlottesville, a 73-year-old man sat at his writing desk and did what he'd always done when the world stopped making sense. He wrote it down. Thomas Jefferson had been keeping detailed weather records for decades. Temperature readings taken twice a day, barometric pressure, wind direction, rainfall totals. The journals he kept were meticulous, obsessive in the way that only a man of enormous intellectual curiosity could sustain across 50 years of farming. And what his instruments were telling him in the summer of 1816 didn't fit any pattern he'd ever recorded. The numbers were wrong. Not wrong the way an unusual season sometimes is, but wrong in a way that felt structural, as if the relationship between the month on the calendar and the temperature in the air had quietly dissolved. On June 17th, 1816, Jefferson noted in his garden book that the cold had done serious damage to his corn. By July, he was writing to friends about the extraordinary nature of the season, searching for historical precedent and finding none. He had survived revolution. He'd designed a republic on paper and watched it stagger into existence. He'd ridden out wars and scandals and the deaths of people he loved. But this particular wrongness, a summer that kept refusing to be summer, unsettled him in a way those larger events never had. It offered no explanation, and there was no one to negotiate with. What's remarkable is that Jefferson, one of the most scientifically curious minds of his age, recorded all of this with meticulous care and still couldn't explain a single word of it. The political world of 1816, meanwhile, was moving forward with the easy confidence of a young nation that believed its best years were still ahead. The era of good feelings was beginning. James Monroe had just been elected president by an overwhelming margin. The Federalist opposition was fading, and there was, across the country, a mood of genuine national optimism that had been building since the end of the War of 1812. America had fought the British a second time and survived. The economy was growing. The Western territories were opening. New states were entering the Union with regularity. The experiment in self-governance that Jefferson's generation had launched in 1776 was, by 1816, looking like it was actually going to work. That was the backdrop, that specific confidence, that forward momentum against which the year without a summer arrived. It didn't fall on a nation that was already struggling. It fell on one that was feeling good about itself. And when you're expecting abundance, scarcity carries a particular cruelty. Across the eastern seaboard, across the frontier settlements pushing into Ohio and Kentucky, people were writing the same disorientation into whatever surface was close at hand. One New England correspondent wrote in July of the most gloomy and extraordinary weather he'd ever seen. Another described waking to find ice on the water bucket in August, and standing there in the early morning light, unable to make sense of what the season had become. What none of them knew, what none of them could possibly have known, was that the cause of everything they were living through had already happened. It had happened the previous April, on the other side of the planet, on an island most Americans couldn't have named, and it had been one of the most violent events in the history of the Earth. The summer of 1816 wasn't random. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a warning from the sky. It was the aftermath of something enormous, and the fact that nobody in America understood that is perhaps the most important thing about this story. But before we get to the cause, and we will get there, we need to understand what life in 1816 America actually felt like, what it smelled like, what it sounded like when you stepped out of your farmhouse door in the morning and breathed in air that should have been warming, but wasn't. Because to understand why the year without a summer broke so many things, you first have to understand exactly what it broke. So, what was everyday life really like when the sky went wrong? And how quickly did people realize that something had changed in the deep structure of the season? Something that couldn't be undone no matter how many times they replanted. Think about the smell of wood smoke in April. Not the sharp, oily smell of a fire that's been burning all night, but the smell of a breakfast fire, newly started. The kind of smell that wraps around a farmhouse in the early morning dark and drifts out through the gaps in the doorframe into air that's still cold, but on its way to becoming something else. That's the smell of 1816 America waking up. That, and wet mud, and animals, and bread baked the day before, still wrapped in cloth near the hearth, because there wasn't enough wheat to grind this week, but there might be some next week if the weather held. In 1816, roughly 8 million people lived in the United States. 8 million people, scattered across a landmass that felt, to the people living on it, almost impossibly vast, almost impossibly wild at the edges. The cities existed. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston. They had newspapers and counting houses and brick sidewalks and the first stirrings of a commercial world. But the cities weren't the country. The country was the farm. About 80% of all Americans at that time lived and worked on the land, in conditions that would be almost unrecognizable to anyone alive today, not because they were primitive, but because they were so completely organized around the rhythms of the natural world. The sun said when to rise, the season said what to plant, the harvest said whether your family would eat through the winter or spend the final months of the year choosing between hunger and debt. Most people don't realize just how total that dependence was, not as a hardship people complained about, but as the basic structure of life that nobody questioned. A farm family in upstate New York or central Vermont or western Massachusetts in the spring of 1816 was running on an annual calendar so deeply ingrained it worked almost like instinct. February was for mending fences, sharpening tools, and planning the kitchen garden. March was for tapping the maple trees. That early sugar crop was crucial, one of the few reliable sources of sweetness and real caloric density available before the main harvest came in. April was for preparing the soil, turning it with oxen if you had them, by hand with a spade if you didn't. And May was for planting: corn, potatoes, rye, oats, beans. The exact sequence, the exact spacing, the quiet prayer said over the first row of seed going into the ground. These things varied by family and by region, but the urgency behind them was the same everywhere. What you put in the ground in May was what you'd eat the following winter. There was no grocery store, no government assistance program, no insurance policy, no backup plan, no fallback of any kind. There was the ground, and what it gave you, and nothing else. The farmhouses themselves were built for function above everything else. In New England, they were typically heavy timber-frame structures, thick post and beam filled in with plaster or brick, with low ceilings that kept warmth close to the people living below. A central chimney served several fireplaces at once. The kitchen hearth was the longest burning fire in the house, kept alive from before sunrise until well after dark, used for cooking, for warmth, for light, for drying wet clothing, and for the simple comfort of something that was always there. The furniture was heavy and handmade. The glass in the windows, where there was glass, was hand-blown and slightly wavy, distorting the outside world into something almost dreamlike. In winter, rags were stuffed into gaps in the walls to hold the cold back. In warmer months, the same gaps were left open to let air through. The children of 1816 worked, not in the harsh, industrial sense that would come later with the mills and the factories, but in the quiet, embedded, unsentimental way of a family that needed every able-bodied member contributing at every possible hour. A child of 6 was carrying water. A child of 8 was feeding pigs, pulling weeds, churning butter. By 10 or 12, a farm child in New England or the mid-Atlantic was doing work that would require a paid adult labourer today. This wasn't cruelty. It was survival in an economy where labour was the only real capital most families had. The children understood their place in it the same way they understood the seasons, as a fact of life, not a subject for debate. In the small towns, things were a little different, but not dramatically so. A craftsman's family, a blacksmith, a cooper, a cobbler, had more access to the commercial economy, more room to trade skills for goods. But they were still tied to the agricultural cycle underneath it all. If the harvest failed and the farmers had no money, the craftsmen had no customers. If the price of corn and oats doubled, the cost of feeding the family horse doubled with it, and the horse was the craftsman's truck, his toolbox and his delivery vehicle, all rolled into one. The town and the farm weren't separate economies. They were one system, tightly connected, sharing every weakness. The roads of 1816 were not roads in any sense we'd recognise today. They were rutted dirt tracks, often impassable in the mud of spring, and barely manageable in the depths of winter. Goods moved slowly, expensively, and with no guarantees. A barrel of flour shipped by water from one city to another moved cheaply and in reasonable time. That same barrel moved overland could cost 3, 4, sometimes 5 times as much per mile and take weeks longer to arrive. This meant that a food price spike in Vermont didn't automatically show up as a spike in Virginia. The connection between those markets was slow and fragile. In ordinary years, that kind of isolation was merely inconvenient. In 1816, it would become something far worse. The rivers were the true highways. The Connecticut, the Hudson, the Delaware, the Susquehanna. These were the arteries of the early republic, the channels along which goods and people and news actually moved at any real speed. A flatboat on the Ohio River could carry a family's entire belongings from Pittsburgh to Cincinnati in a matter of days. The same trip by road could take weeks and break wheels and axles and horses in the process. That's why settlements followed rivers so closely in this period, not just for the water itself, but for the connection that water made possible. The spring of 1816 arrived with the same quiet promise as every spring before it. The snow melted, mostly on schedule. The rivers ran high with snowmelt as they always did. The mud of March and April was deep and universal, the kind that swallowed wagon wheels up to the axle and held them there, the kind that closed certain roads for weeks at a stretch. But farmers knew mud. Mud was simply part of the arrangement. You waited for it to drain, and then you planted. What nobody was waiting for, what nobody had any frame of reference to expect, was a May that felt more like early March, a June that brought snow to the hilltops of Vermont, then crept down into the valleys, then reached the coastal towns, a sky that stayed pale and milky and flat when it should have burned open and blue, a sun that rose and set, but didn't seem, somehow, to be fully present in form but not in warmth, like a fire that gives light but no heat at all. The birds noticed first, or rather, the farmers noticed the birds noticing. The robins that normally arrived in April still hadn't appeared in parts of northern New England by late May. The swallows that usually fill the evening air over the ponds sat quietly on their perches. The bees that typically worked the apple blossoms moved through them without their usual sense of urgency. The farmers couldn't have said exactly what felt off about the spring of 1816. They just knew that something did. The way you sense a room has a smell, even when you can't quite name it. The way you hear a wrong note in a piece of music before you've consciously identified what it is. By the end of May, that feeling had taken on a shape. By June, it had a name. Not the name we'd use now. They wouldn't have understood the name we use now. They just called it cold. They called it the wrong season. They called it, in the plain language of people who knew the land directly, a ruination. What they couldn't yet know was that the ruination was only beginning, and that the same thing happening to their fields in Vermont and New York was happening, at that very moment, to fields in France and Germany and Switzerland and China and India. This wasn't a local problem. It wasn't a regional anomaly. It was a wound spreading cold across every latitude in the Northern Hemisphere, quietly, all at once. Who was feeling it the hardest, and who was already making the calculations that would slowly, quietly, change the map of America forever? Here's what most people assume about the year without a summer, if they've heard of it at all. They assume it was a New England problem. A northeastern weather event. Bad, certainly. Unusual, certainly. But ultimately regional. The kind of thing that hit farmers in Vermont and Massachusetts while life continued more or less normally everywhere else. They picture it as something cold and local, confined to the frost-prone hills of the northern states. They assume that by the time you crossed into Pennsylvania or Virginia, the summer of 1816 was pretty much ordinary. And they assume, if they think about it at all, that people figured out the cause fairly quickly, adapted and moved on. Every one of those assumptions is wrong. The year without a summer wasn't a New England event. It was a global catastrophe with almost no parallel in recorded human history. It struck every continent in the Northern Hemisphere at once. It killed crops in France, Germany, Switzerland, China, and India. It triggered a famine across the British Isles that left thousands dead. It contributed to the outbreak of a cholera pandemic, the second in recorded history, that would go on to kill hundreds of thousands across Asia and Europe before it finally burned itself out. And it's connected through a chain of causation the historians have spent decades quietly tracing to some of the most significant upheavals of the early 19th century. Mass migrations, political revolutions, and the birth of literary work still being read 200 years later. All of it caused not by anything that happened in America, not by anything that unfolded in Europe or Asia, but by a single geological event on a small island in the Pacific. An event so enormous that it temporarily altered the chemical composition of the entire atmosphere, wrapping the planet in a veil of particles so fine, so widely dispersed, that they changed the quality of sunlight reaching Earth's surface for 2 full years. The cause was a volcano, not one that anyone in 1816 America would have recognized. Not Vesuvius, whose ancient eruption was still the gold standard for volcanic catastrophe in Western memory. Not anything in the Western Hemisphere at all. A volcano called Tambora on an island called Sumbawa in a chain of islands that most Americans at the time would have placed only vaguely as somewhere near the East Indies. It erupted in April of 1815, not 1816, the year the cold was felt, but 1815. A full year before the summer that never came, and it did so with a force so far beyond anything in the modern human record that comparing it to other volcanoes almost doesn't make sense. Tambora ejected somewhere between 80 and 150 cubic kilometers of magma, ash, and gas. Think about that for a moment, because the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, which killed 57 people, flattened 600 square miles of forest, and felt to everyone watching like a once-in-a-generation disaster, ejected roughly 1 cubic kilometre of material. Tambora was larger by a factor of more than 100. The sound of the eruption was heard over 1,000 miles away. The crater that collapsed at its summit was nearly 4 miles across and almost a mile deep. The mountain itself went from being one of the tallest peaks in the Indonesian archipelago to being 1,000 feet shorter, overnight. In the surrounding area, approximately 71,000 people died. From the initial blasts, the pyroclastic flows, the tsunamis, and the ashfall that buried entire villages under meters of grey material that killed every living thing it covered. But the most consequential thing Tambora released wasn't the lava. It wasn't the ash. It was the gas. Specifically, an estimated 60 million metric tons of sulfur dioxide injected high into the stratosphere, far above the weather, far above the clouds, into the layer of the atmosphere where winds move slowly and carry things for years rather than days. Up there, sulfur dioxide reacts with water vapour to form tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, and those droplets scatter incoming solar radiation. They act as a thin veil, stretched quietly across the entire planet, reducing the amount of sunlight that actually reaches the surface below. By late 1815, Tambora's aerosol veil had circled the Earth. Its effects, a global temperature drop of roughly half a degree to a full degree, were already appearing in weather records across Europe and Asia before the year was out. But here's the part that should give you pause. None of this was known in 1816 America. Not one person in the United States understood the connection between a volcano in Indonesia and the cold summer destroying their fields. The knowledge simply didn't exist yet. The science that would eventually link stratospheric aerosols to surface temperature change was still a century away. There were no global weather networks, no satellites, no international communication fast enough to connect an eruption in the Pacific to a harvest failure in Vermont in any time frame that could have helped a single family. Farmers in Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire were living through the direct consequences of the largest volcanic eruption in the modern era, and had absolutely no way of knowing it. Every morning they looked up at that cold, pale sky and searched their memories, their experience, their faith, for some kind of answer. Some turned to religion, God's judgment, a cosmic sign, some punishment for a collective sin they couldn't name. Others turned to folk weather traditions, scanning the old almanacs for a precedent that wasn't there. And some simply put their heads down, replanted, tried again, and quietly watched each new planting fail in turn. The myth that this was a known, understood, manageable event gets dismantled by a single fact. The cause of the year without a summer wasn't formally identified and scientifically confirmed until 1920, more than 100 years after the event itself. The first rigorous paper connecting Tambora's eruption to the 1816 temperature records was published by William Humphreys of the US Weather Bureau. The people who lived through that terrible year never knew why it happened. They died not knowing. Their children died not knowing. 3 full generations of Americans carried the aftermath of 1816 without ever having access to the explanation. And there's a second myth worth setting aside, one that cuts a little closer to the bone, the idea that the effects were mainly agricultural. Yes, the crop failures were devastating. Yes, the food insecurity that followed touched millions of people in very real ways. But the year without a summer also worked as a cultural trigger, a disruption so deep that it shook loose ideas that had been sitting quietly in people's minds and sent them in directions that reshaped literature, science, and political thought for generations. A small group of writers and poets sheltering near Lake Geneva that summer, unable to go outside because of the relentless cold and rain, decided to pass the time by writing ghost stories. One of them was 18 years old. Her name was Mary Shelley. The story she began that summer, in the grey, sunless aftermath of Tambora's cloud, was Frankenstein. So the myth is this, that the year without a summer was a weather event that hit some farms in the northeastern United States, and then it was over. The deeper truth, the one that's harder to sit with, is that the people who survived it never understood what it had been. The hardship was processed, absorbed and slowly overwritten by the return of normal summers, by the migration that scattered damaged communities westward, by the quiet human need to simply keep moving forward. The lessons that 1816 could have offered, about the hidden connections within the global climate system, about how an event on one side of the planet can quietly destroy a harvest on the other, those lessons went largely unlearned, because the science to explain them didn't exist yet, and the structures needed to preserve that kind of understanding weren't in place. The year without a summer was survived. It wasn't understood, and that difference matters more than most people realize. It was a rupture at the planetary level, one that Americans felt deeply, suffered through without any explanation, and survived in ways that slowly changed the country's geography, its culture, and its sense of how fragile the line really is between civilization and the natural world. But who felt all of this most directly? Who was the human face of this catastrophe? And what did it cost them in ways that went far beyond the price of a bushel of corn? The first thing Thomas Jefferson did every morning without exception was check the thermometer. He'd kept that habit for nearly 40 years by the time the summer of 1816 arrived. He owned several thermometers, a remarkable thing in an era when precision instruments of any kind were expensive and hard to come by. He consulted them with the same regularity and seriousness that other men gave to their morning prayers. Temperature was, for Jefferson, one of the primary facts of daily life. It shaped the planting calendar, the ripening schedule, the timing of the harvest, the survival odds of seedlings and cuttings and new grafts. He recorded every reading in ink, in his careful, angular handwriting, in the notebooks he called his garden book and his farm book. Those records have survived. Historians have been studying them for generations, because they represent one of the most detailed, continuous weather observations from this entire period of American history. In the summer of 1816, those same notebooks became a document of slow-motion disaster. Jefferson was 73 years old that year. He'd been out of public life for 7 years, retired from the presidency in 1809, freed at last from the constant negotiation and performance that high office demands. He'd returned to Monticello with the life he'd always intended for himself. Reading, correspondence, the careful redesign of his house and grounds, and the management of a plantation that was, by the standards of his time and class, both enormous and increasingly difficult to sustain. Monticello covered 5,000 acres. It required the labour of more than 100 enslaved men, women and children. It produced wheat, corn, tobacco, vegetables, fruit and timber. And it produced debt. Enormous, compounding, seemingly permanent debt that had followed Jefferson his entire adult life and would outlast him. What strikes me most is this. By 1816, Jefferson owed somewhere in the neighbourhood of $100,000, which in the currency of that time was the rough equivalent of several $1 million today, carried by a man with no salary and no income beyond whatever his land could produce. He'd borrowed against his fields, against future harvests, against the value of the people he enslaved. He'd taken loans from friends, from creditors, from his own son-in-law. In the most precise financial sense, he was insolvent, and he knew it. He'd known it for years. He managed that knowledge the way careful people manage uncomfortable truths, by holding on to the hope that the next good harvest, the next successful season, would buy enough time to find a longer-term way through. The summer of 1816 did not help. That spring, the corn planting at Monticello went in on schedule, the way it always did. Jefferson walked the rows himself, walking stick in hand, examining the soil, directing the work of the enslaved men and women doing the planting under his supervision. He was optimistic that year. He'd been testing different corn varieties, looking for strains that might yield more per acre. The winter of 1815 to 1816 had been relatively mild, which he read as a good sign. The fields were well prepared. The timing felt right. Then May refused to warm. June brought frost to the Monticello hillside. Frost in June in central Virginia. Something extraordinary enough that Jefferson noted it in his garden book without a single word of alarm. Just the numbers, the date, the damage to the corn rows. By mid-June, the losses were already significant. He wrote to his old friend John Adams that month, "We have had the most extraordinary cold season I have ever known in Virginia. Frosts in June and July have destroyed the greater part of the crops," he added, with the quiet restraint of a man who'd learned long ago not to let despair into his writing. That he wasn't sure what the rest of the summer would bring. What it brought was more of the same. July stayed cold. A second planting of corn went in and struggled. The wheat that had been his more reliable crop in earlier years came in thin and disappointing. The tobacco he'd largely moved away from failed almost entirely in some of his fields. And his vegetable garden, which he tended with something close to obsession, testing dozens of varieties from correspondents around the world, tracking every planting and harvest with the precision of a scientist, suffered in ways he recorded with meticulous, quietly anguished exactness. What made Jefferson's situation so telling wasn't just what he was going through, it was the position he occupied while going through it. He was one of the most recognized men in America, former president, author of the Declaration of Independence, founder of the University of Virginia, a correspondent of kings, philosophers, and scientists across 3 continents. And at the same time, in the most practical sense, he was a heavily indebted farmer watching his crops fail in a summer that made no sense, unable to meet his payments, unable to service loans already years past due, entirely dependent on harvests that the season kept refusing to deliver. He didn't write about the fear. Men of his class and era didn't put fear into letters, but it's there, between the lines, in how often the weather notations appear, in the carefully hedged language he used with creditors. The season has been unfavourable in ways that make it difficult to predict the harvest, in the widening gap between the composed, serene public figure and the private man watching his circumstances quietly worsen with every cold morning. The enslaved people at Monticello experienced the failed harvest in an entirely different way. They didn't own the crops, they didn't carry the debt, but they carried the hunger. Because when a harvest came in thin, what reached the quarters and the cabins at the edges of the plantation was thinner still. Rations were cut. The small vegetable gardens that enslaved families tended on their own time, in the hours before dawn, in the hours after dark, produced less in the cold summer of 1816 than they had in any normal year. The people with the least power over their circumstances bore the most direct physical cost of a catastrophe they had absolutely no hand in creating. Jefferson's response to the failed harvest was the same response he brought to every difficult problem. He gathered information, he wrote letters, he consulted the historical record, he made plans, he compared observations with neighbours and with correspondents far away. He exchanged notes with James Madison, who was farming nearby and experiencing the same losses. He searched his library for any account of a season this strange in American or European history, and found nothing that quite matched. What he couldn't do, what no one in the United States in 1816 could do, was understand why any of it was happening, and that absence of explanation was perhaps the most disorienting part of all. Jefferson was a man who believed in causes, in the logical structure of the natural world, in the idea that careful observation leads to understanding, and understanding leads to action. But 1816 offered him no explanation. It offered only cold and failing crops and mounting debt, and silence. The silence was, in its own way, the hardest thing to hold. He was corresponding with the most scientifically minded men in the United States and across Europe. Astronomers, naturalists, agricultural theorists, men who tracked sunspot cycles and barometric pressure, and considered themselves the sharpest observers the natural world had produced. None of them had an answer. Some had theories. Some had their own regional data confirming how extraordinary the season was, without shedding any light on what was causing it. The combined intelligence of the Enlightenment's finest minds, turned toward the summer of 1816, produced nothing that could have helped a single Vermont farmer decide whether to replant one more time or start loading the wagon. The most learned men in the Western world were standing in the same darkness as everyone else. They just had slightly better language for describing what the dark felt like, and so Jefferson kept taking the temperature every morning, without exception, writing down the numbers quietly in that careful handwriting of his, waiting for a summer that kept refusing to arrive. What was he doing to hold his financial situation together while the season stripped away the harvest he'd been counting on? And what were ordinary American families without his connections, without his resources, without any of his options, doing when they finally understood that this summer wasn't going to turn around, and that the decision between staying and leaving was going to have to be made before the cold settled in for good? Here's the thing about 1816 that changes everything once you really see it. The year without a summer wasn't just an American story. It wasn't even primarily an American story. It was the first truly global weather event in recorded history. The first time a single natural phenomenon reshaped the daily lives of people on every inhabited continent at the same time. From the rice farmers of Yunnan province in China, to the rye farmers of Bavaria, to the potato farmers of County Cork, to the wheat farmers of central Virginia, all of them the same disrupted season, all at once. And when you pull back far enough to see the whole picture, the scale of what happened becomes genuinely hard to absorb, not just as a catalogue of suffering, but as a moment when the fragility of agricultural civilization was laid bare across the entire planet in a single growing season. In Europe, 1816 was catastrophic in ways that make the American experience look contained by comparison. The Napoleonic Wars had just ended. France and its neighbours were already exhausted, their economies broken, their farmland depleted by years of military occupation and displacement. The harvest failure of 1816 fell on people who were already weakened, already stretched, already standing close to the edge. Switzerland, Germany, France, and the British Isles all recorded devastating crop failures that year. In Ireland, where the potato was already the primary source of calories for the rural poor, the collapse of 1816 was a quiet preview of the far greater catastrophe that would arrive 3 decades later. Grain prices across Western Europe rose by as much as 400% in some areas. Bread riots broke out in France, in Germany, in England. Mobs attacked grain stores and bakeries, and the homes of merchants suspected of hoarding food, while ordinary families went hungry. In some Swiss cantons, governments issued emergency rations and banned the export of food entirely. In Bavaria, the starving rural poor were eating cats and dogs and grass. In France, political unrest that had been simmering for years boiled over into violence that would eventually contribute to the fall of the Bourbon monarchy. The migration that followed the European famine of 1816 planted the seeds of something that would reshape the United States over the decades ahead. Tens of thousands of German, Swiss, and Irish emigrants who'd been quietly weighing the move to America were pushed across that threshold by what happened in 1816 and the hard years that followed. The great wave of European immigration the historians mark as beginning in the 1820s and accelerating through the 1840s and beyond. It's rooted, at least in part, in the demographic disruption caused by a volcanic eruption in Indonesia in 1815. Tambora's ash didn't just fall on the Dutch East Indies. Over time, invisibly, it settled on the entire future population of the United States. In China, Tambora's effects were felt most severely in Yunnan province, where the collapse of the normal monsoon patterns produced a cold, wet summer that wiped out the rice harvest and triggered a famine that killed tens of thousands. And that disruption had a consequence nobody at the time could have connected to a volcano. It created conditions ideal for a new, more virulent strain of cholera to take hold and begin spreading. The cholera pandemic that started in Bengal around 1817, what historians call the Second Pandemic, isn't directly caused by Tambora. But the displacement, the malnutrition, the breakdown of water systems across Asia in the aftermath of 1816 gave cholera the conditions it needed to move faster and kill more people than it otherwise would have. That pandemic eventually reached Europe. It reached the United States. It killed hundreds of thousands. It permanently changed public health policy, city planning, and the design of water systems across the developed world. And it started in the aftermath of a volcanic eruption most Americans have never heard of. Now consider the literary side of this, because this is the part that really shifts something. In June of 1816, while Vermont farmers were watching snowfall on their corn and Jefferson was recording cold temperatures in his garden book, a small group of people were sheltering at a house called the Villa Diodati on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. The group included Lord Byron, poet, scandal, self-destruction wrapped in a brilliant mind, who'd recently been forced out of England and was making his way across Europe. It included Percy Bysshe Shelley, travelling with his companion, a teenager named Mary Godwin. And it included a physician named John Polidori, along as Byron's personal doctor. The summer of 1816 in Switzerland was so relentlessly cold and wet and dark, Tambora's aerosol veil was thickest over Europe, that the group couldn't go outside for days at a time. To pass the hours, Byron suggested a competition. Each person in the house would write a ghost story, and that detail has always stayed with me. Because out of a rainy, sunless summer caused by a volcano none of them had heard of, came some of the most enduring stories in the English language. Byron sketched a fragment of a vampire tale he never finished. Polidori took that fragment and turned it into something complete. The Vampire, the first modern vampire story in the English language, the direct ancestor of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And Mary Godwin, 18 years old, having never published a single word, began writing a story about a scientist who assembled a creature from the remains of the dead, and then found he couldn't control what he'd made. She finished it, published it in 1818 under her married name, Mary Shelley. The novel was Frankenstein. Frankenstein, arguably the first science fiction novel ever written, the text that founded an entire genre, was conceived in the cold shadow of a volcanic winter. The idea at its centre of a creator who sets something in motion he doesn't understand and can't contain was born in a house full of grey light and chill because Tambora's sulphuric particles had quietly changed the quality of summer across an entire hemisphere. Byron also wrote his poem Darkness that summer, a slow, haunting meditation on a world draining of warmth, where the last fires are going out one by one. He wrote it as a nightmare. It wasn't entirely fictional. Back in America, the perspective shift was equally significant, just less poetic. The year without a summer didn't only damage farms, it physically relocated a substantial portion of the American population. Vermont alone lost somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people in 1816, and the years immediately after, a meaningful fraction of its total population at the time, gone west to Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, the Illinois Territory. The other New England states saw similar losses, and the Ohio Territory's population grew faster in the years from 1816 to 1820 than in any comparable period before or after in its early history. That migration rewrote American politics in ways that are still visible today. The people who left New England for the Midwest carried their political culture with them, their religious traditions, their values around land, governance, and the proper role of the federal government. The Midwest that grew from that movement was, in many real ways, a transplanted New England. And that culture shaped the political geography of the United States for the next century and a half. The abolitionist movement that eventually ended slavery in this country had its deepest Midwestern roots in communities founded by New England emigrants who'd been driven west by, among other things, a volcanic eruption in Indonesia. And not one person who made that move knew the first thing about Tambora. They left because the summer stopped working. They left because the farms failed, and the debt kept growing, and the cold kept returning. They left because America had a western edge that kept moving outward, and when everything you'd built in one place collapsed under you, you turned toward that edge and started again. They didn't leave because of a volcano. They left because the sky had gone wrong in ways they couldn't account for, and the only reasonable response was to find a sky that was still doing what skies were supposed to do. So here's the shift in perspective. The year without a summer wasn't a climate event that happened to American history. It was a geological event. A single eruption, a single column of gas rising high into the stratosphere that quietly helped write American history. Every migration, every settlement, every political boundary, every piece of literature, every epidemic that traces its origin back to 1816 is downstream of Tambora. But the people living through all of it in real time couldn't see any of that. What they saw was the cold, the failed fields, the prices climbing beyond reach, the options narrowing, and the summer of 1816 was only getting started, only just beginning to show what it was willing to do to a generation of people who'd built their entire survival around a season that simply refused to come. How bad did it actually get? And when did people begin to understand that this wasn't going to ease up? Before the last of the seed corn was gone? By June 6th, 1816, it was snowing in New England. Not flurrying, not sleeting. Snowing. The kind of snow that accumulates on flat surfaces and settles into the hollows between furrows and sits there, cold and white and final, on top of corn that was planted 3 weeks earlier. In Savoy, Massachusetts, 8 inches fell on June 6th alone. In parts of Vermont and New Hampshire, the build-up was deep enough to close roads and push farmers back indoors. Farmers who'd gone out that very morning expecting nothing more than a cool spring day. Children who'd been outside in light clothing the week before were back in wool by nightfall. This was the moment something shifted in the minds of the people living through it. Before June 6th, the cold had been alarming. After June 6th, it was something else entirely. It was clear now that this wasn't a late spring dragging its feet. This was a fundamental break with everything anyone alive could call normal. The corn already in the ground was gone, not damaged. Gone. These seedlings that had pushed up through the soil in May, fragile pale green, full of the promise of a harvest, were blackened and limp under the snow. A farmer standing at the edge of his field on the morning of June 7th, looking out at acres of ruined planting, was doing the math in real time. It meant replanting. It meant spending money he didn't have on seed he'd already used once. It meant betting the remaining weeks of the planting window on a sky that had already shown it couldn't be trusted. And it meant that even if the replanting worked, the harvest would arrive later, shorter, thinner, less certain than anything he had planned for. The price of corn began to move in June. Not dramatically at first, not in the way that makes headlines. But the farmers who traded at market days, the merchants who moved grain between towns, the millers watching their stores with close attention, all of them felt the pressure beginning to build. More people needed to buy seed. Fewer people had anything left to sell. The simple arithmetic of supply and demand, operating on a landscape suddenly producing less than it had promised, was slowly starting to tip. July 1816 is one of the most thoroughly documented months in early American agricultural history, precisely because so many people were writing about it in terms of stunned disbelief. Temperature records from across the northeastern states show readings in the 30s and 40s, Fahrenheit in the first 2 weeks of July. Numbers that belong in early April, not in the middle of summer. Hard frosts were recorded in Vermont as late as July 9th. In some counties, the second planting that farmers had put in after the June disaster was already showing cold damage before the month was even half over. The livestock were suffering too. Horses and cattle needed pasture, green, growing, warm-season grass, and the fields weren't producing it. Animals that should have been gaining weight and strength in July, building the reserves they'd need to get through the following winter, were instead burning through whatever they had left from the year before. Cows were giving less milk, oxen were losing muscle. Farmers who depended on their horses to work the land were watching those animals quietly weaken from not having enough to eat. And the cost of hay and supplemental grain was climbing steadily with each passing week. What strikes me most is a single account from a Vermont farmer that July, because it captures everything without a word of self-pity, and somehow that makes it harder to read. He woke before dawn, built the fire, checked the thermometer, found it below freezing. He went out to the barn and discovered 2 of his sheep had died overnight from cold and malnourishment. He fed the surviving animals from a hay supply that was running dangerously low. Then he walked to the cornfield, examined the second planting, counted the plants still alive, and did the calculation in his head. At this rate, he wouldn't have enough corn to feed his family through the winter, let alone enough to cover the note on the mortgage coming due in October. He went back inside and told his wife. She didn't say anything. She poured the morning porridge from a pot that held the last of the oats they had in storage. What the history books tend to skip is what happened in people's minds the morning after a moment like that. What do you do when you've run the numbers and they don't come out? You don't stop immediately. People almost never stop immediately. You replant. You borrow seed from a neighbour. You extend your credit at the general store and hold on to the hope that next month will be different. You eat a little less. You sell something you need but can manage without for a season. And you write a letter to a relative who moved west the year before, asking casually or as if you're just curious what the growing season is like in Ohio. That letter is where the migration begins. Not the dramatic departure, not the loaded wagon under a grey sky. The letter. The quiet question sent to someone who'd already gone. The calculation, made at a kitchen table on a July morning when the thermometer reads 32 degrees and the corn is dead again. By August, the prices had reached numbers that genuinely frightened people who understood what those numbers meant. Oats, which had sold for 12 cents a bushel at the start of the year, were going for 92 cents in some New England markets by fall. A rise of more than 700% in a single season. Corn climbed from around 50 cents a bushel to several dollars. Salt pork, the dietary staple of families who couldn't afford fresh meat, doubled in price, then tripled. And potatoes, which had always been the dependable backup crop in a cold New England spring, failed in the ground right alongside everything else. The newspapers that could get information out quickly, and in 1816, that was a very relative term, started publishing accounts that were alarming and wholly insufficient at the same time. They could report that the weather was extraordinary. They couldn't say why. They could note that prices were rising. They couldn't tell anyone when or whether they'd stop. They could print letters from farmers describing complete crop failures, but they couldn't offer any explanation beyond the visible: the cold, the frost, the warmth that never came, because the visible was all anyone had access to. The churches were full. That's a consistent pattern in moments of agricultural crisis, and 1816 was no different. When the material world fails in ways that resist explanation, people reach for frameworks that offer meaning without requiring proof. The year, without a summer, fed directly into the religious revivals sweeping New England at the time. The Second Great Awakening, already building momentum in this period, found new urgency in congregations that were literally hungry and cold in months when they should have been neither. Preachers who could frame the crisis as divine purpose, judgment, testing, refinement, found attentive audiences in communities that desperately needed any story that gave the suffering some kind of shape. A freezing summer didn't feel like weather. It felt like something directed, something deliberate, something that demanded a response at the level of the soul, not just the seed bin. Whether that reading was theologically sound was a conversation for another time. In the middle of the crisis, it was the only framework many people had that made the suffering feel like anything other than random. But faith didn't fill the grain bins. Prayer didn't warm the nights in July. And by the end of August, when the third planting of the season was yielding a thin, sparse harvest, where it yielded anything at all, the calculations that had started in June had quietly become decisions. People who'd written careful, measured letters to Ohio relatives in July were writing more urgent ones in September. People who'd been watching and waiting and hoping were now watching the frost arrive ahead of schedule. September frost, October frost, the earliest hard freezes in living memory, and understanding slowly that the winter was going to arrive without the buffer of a good harvest to cushion it. Something had been driving all of this. Something specific. Something that had already happened, broadcasting its consequences across the planet from a location so distant that the idea of a connection would have been incomprehensible to anyone sitting in a cold New England farmhouse that August. Something that had unfolded on the other side of the world, in a place that didn't appear on any map most Americans owned, set in motion by forces no human authority had commanded and none could have stopped. That something had a name, and the story of how it came to be, and why not a single person in America knew it was coming, is where this story takes its darkest, most important turn. On the night of April 10th, 1815, the island of Sumbawa in the Dutch East Indies ceased to be what it had been. The eruption of Mount Tambora didn't begin with a bang. It had been grumbling for months. Small explosions, minor ash emissions, the kind of low-level activity that the people living near the mountain had come to treat as ordinary background noise. The volcano's everyday conversation with the world. The Dutch colonial administration in Batavia had noted the rumblings but issued no warnings. Tambora had been restless for a decade. There was no reason, based on anything anyone had lived through, to expect what came next. What came next was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. At approximately 7 in the evening on April 10th, 1815, Tambora entered a phase of activity so extreme that language barely holds it. 3 columns of fire, actual columns of fire visible from dozens of miles away, erupted simultaneously from the mountain's summit. The sound was so immense it was heard over 1,000 miles away in multiple directions, in Sumatra to the west, in Ternate to the north, on the island of Java. British naval officers aboard ships hundreds of miles from Sumbawa heard the explosions and assumed they were cannon fire from a battle nearby. They changed course to assist, found nothing, and only later came to understand what they had actually been listening to. The eruption continued for 2 days. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and volcanic material travelling at hundreds of miles per hour, poured down the mountain's flanks and reached the sea on multiple sides of the island, boiling the water and sending tsunamis across the surrounding coastline. The main settlement of Tambora was completely obliterated. The ashfall was heavy enough to collapse rooftops across Sumbawa and drift across dozens of surrounding islands. Rafts of floating pumice, some covering square miles of open ocean, were still being encountered by passing ships weeks after the eruption. The sky above the region stayed dark for days, a combination of volcanic ash and dense sulphurous gas that blocked out the sun entirely. When the final count was eventually assembled, and it took months because the region was so devastated that basic communication was nearly impossible, the death toll stood at approximately 71,000 people. That includes those killed in the initial flows and tsunamis, but also the larger number who died in the weeks and months that followed, from ash-covered fields that couldn't grow a thing, from contaminated water, from illness, from slow starvation. Tambora didn't only kill with fire, it killed with the long, quiet aftermath of total agricultural collapse. And that detail has always stayed with me, because an entire people, the Tamborans, who had their own distinct language, their own customs, their own way of living, were simply erased. Gone so completely that historians still can't fully piece together who they were. The Sultan of Sangir, whose domain covered the area near Tambora, sent a report to Dutch authorities in Batavia, describing the destruction in terms that would have read like apocalyptic fiction if anyone had been willing to take them seriously. An entire civilization gone. And none of this reached the United States in any meaningful way. News did arrive eventually. Brief reports of a great eruption in the East Indies appeared in a few American papers in the fall of 1815, buried deep in the foreign news sections, offered without scientific context, without any suggestion that the event carried implications beyond the immediate tragedy on a distant island. No American newspaper drew any connection between Tambora and weather. No American scientist, and there were very few at the time who'd have been thinking along those lines, raised any concern about potential effects on the atmosphere. The idea that a volcanic eruption in the Pacific could alter the temperature of a summer in New England simply didn't exist as a concept in 1815. But up in the stratosphere, that relationship was already being written. The sulfur dioxide Tambora sent into the upper atmosphere, an estimated 60 million metric tons, roughly 100 times what the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption released, converted within months into droplets of sulfuric acid. Those droplets, each one microscopic, each one individually invisible, together formed a thin reflective veil that spread across the Earth's middle latitudes by early 1816. They didn't absorb sunlight. They scattered it, bouncing a fraction of incoming solar radiation back into space before it could reach the surface and warm it. The fraction was small in absolute terms, 2 to 3% of incoming solar energy, but 2 to 3% applied uniformly across the entire northern hemisphere over an entire growing season. That translates to temperature drops that destroy crops, kill livestock, and displace millions of people. The power at work here is almost unsettling in how completely indifferent it was to human hierarchy. The same aerosol veil killing wheat in Vermont was simultaneously killing rye in France. The same reduction in solar warmth freezing Jefferson's corn in Virginia was collapsing the rice harvest in Yunnan province, China. The wealthiest man in America and the poorest labourer in Germany were both living through the same physical phenomenon. Neither of them had caused it. Neither of them understood it. and neither of them could do a single thing to stop it. Here's the hidden layer that no one in 1816 America could see. They were being charged for a transaction they'd never agreed to. They were drawing from an account they didn't know existed. A mountain on the far side of the planet had made a massive withdrawal from the global climate, and every farmer who walked out to a field of blackened corn in Vermont that June was handed the bill without ever having seen the invoice. The Dutch colonial administration knew Tambora had erupted. They sent ships. They attempted inadequately to provide some relief to the stricken region. But the connection between what Tambora had released into the stratosphere and the temperature anomalies being recorded across Europe and America in 1816, that connection was made by no one. The colonial governor in Batavia was trying to manage the immediate disaster on Sumbawa. The farmers in Vermont, the scientists in Paris, the merchants in London, all of them were living through the aerosol effects independently, with no shared framework for understanding that they were all experiencing the same thing at the same time. The science that would eventually explain it wouldn't exist until the 20th century. The global communication networks that would let researchers on different continents share observations in real time, those were a century and a half away. In 1816, the world was suffering through a global crisis in perfectly sealed, separate compartments, each community alone, each one quietly inventing its own explanation for something that had a single, real physical cause none of them could see. So what did Americans in 1816 believe was behind the cold? The theories spread across the full range of what was available to them. Some pointed to sunspot activity, and that theory wasn't entirely baseless. The period from 1790 to 1830 was indeed a period of reduced solar output, known today as the Dalton minimum, which contributed modestly to the cold. But it wasn't the primary cause. Others attributed the strange season to the clearing of eastern forests, arguing that stripped land runs colder than wooded land. There was some observational grounding in that idea too. Still others blamed the pattern of the previous winter, and many, perhaps most ordinary Americans operating within the biblical providentialist framework that was the default lens for understanding the unexplained, attributed it to divine will. Cosmic judgment. A God whose purposes weren't for human beings to fully know. Every one of those explanations was wrong. The actual cause was sitting quietly in the stratosphere, invisible to every person it was affecting, slowly scattering sunlight back into space while the people below tried to understand why their food kept dying. This is the hidden layer of the year without a summer. Not just that the cause was unknown, but that the structure of human knowledge in 1816 made it essentially unknowable. The gap between the cause and the people enduring its consequences wasn't only geographic, it was a gap in understanding itself. They didn't have the tools to see it. They couldn't have built those tools in time to help anyone. They were living through a reality, cold fields, dead crops, rising prices, impossible choices, that was completely disconnected from any explanation that could have helped them respond more effectively. And yet, people survived. Not all of them. Not without terrible cost. But the ways in which ordinary Americans, and famous ones, and entirely forgotten ones, navigated the worst agricultural crisis in the young nation's history. Those ways tell us something important about what human beings do when they're faced with catastrophe they can't explain. How did they get through it? And what did it actually cost them to make it through a winter with no harvest to carry them? The smell of a farmhouse kitchen in the winter of 1816 was different from any winter that had come before it. Not different in any pleasant way. Different the way absence always carries a smell. The smell of what should have been there and wasn't. In a normal New England December, a kitchen smelled of salt pork simmering low in a pot, of dried apples, of cornmeal mush thickening over the fire, of the particular sweetness that rises from a root cellar packed tight with turnips and potatoes and beets and carrots. The winter of 1816 smelled thinner. The pots were emptier. The root cellars were frighteningly light. The smokehouse held less than it should have, because there hadn't been enough corn or oats to properly fatten the pigs before slaughter, and lean pigs don't give you fat salt pork, and fat salt pork was what stood between a family and a very long northern winter. The people who made it through the winter of 1816 to 1817 did so by eating things they wouldn't ordinarily have thought of as food. Not by choice, by necessity, with the quiet, matter-of-fact resourcefulness of people who'd been solving hard problems their whole lives and were now applying that same skill to the most fundamental problem of all. Families across Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and New York boiled nettles into broth. They cooked pigweed and lamb's quarters, plants that technically counted as weeds in the garden, but turned out to be edible with enough time over a fire. They ate woodchuck, they ate crow, which even the most charitable accounts from the period described as difficult. They ground tree bark into a rough kind of meal, and mixed it with whatever grain was left to make it go a little further. The poorest families ate things they didn't write down. We know some of them survived. We know others didn't. And the historical record is appropriately quiet about the details of those hardest months, because the people who kept records were, almost by definition, the ones with the most margin to spare. The horses were dying. That detail appears in account after account from 1816 and 1817, and it carries a weight that goes beyond the animals themselves. A horse in 1816. America wasn't a luxury, it was infrastructure. It was the tractor, the delivery truck, and the engine of virtually all agricultural work, of commerce, of any travel that went beyond walking distance. A farm family that lost its horses lost its ability to plant in spring, harvest in fall, move goods to market, or bring supplies back home. The horse was the connecting thread between a family and everything it depended on. And in the winter of 1816 to 1817, with hay and oats at prices many families simply couldn't meet, horses were quietly starving to death in their stalls across the northeastern states. One New Hampshire diarist wrote of finding 3 of his neighbours' horses dead in the barn one January morning in 1817. Not from cold. Horses in decent condition can tolerate bitter cold. From starvation. Ribs visible through their coats, eyes sunken, hay racks empty for weeks because there had been nothing left to fill them with. The neighbour had tried. He'd fed them bark, dried fern. He'd stripped the thatch from an outbuilding and offered that. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Because the crop that should have produced their feed had failed in June, and July and August, and the winter was very, very long. At Monticello, Thomas Jefferson navigated the crisis with the resources available to a man of his standing, which meant more options than most people had, but not nearly enough to make things comfortable. He managed his mounting debt by writing letters. Careful, measured, diplomatically worded letters to creditors, explaining that the extraordinary season had set back his plans for repayment. He ran the numbers again and again, the thin corn harvest, the disappointing wheat yields, trying to find some arrangement of debits and credits that would carry him through to the next planting season without a catastrophic default. He wrote to friends who might be in a position to help, not asking directly for money. Jefferson never asked directly for money, but framing his situation in terms that a perceptive reader would understand without being told. And through all of it, he kept farming. That detail says more about Jefferson's character than perhaps anything else from this period. In the middle of financial anxiety, failing crops, and the physical slowdown of his 73rd year, he maintained the meticulous daily practice that had been his discipline for half a century. He kept checking the thermometer. He kept recording in his garden book what was growing and what wasn't, which beds were holding on, and which had given up entirely. He was quietly building an observational record of the year without a summer that historians would still be drawing on 2 centuries later. He didn't know that's what he was doing. He was simply doing what he'd always done, paying close attention, writing it down, refusing to look away. What's remarkable is that the enslaved workers at Monticello left almost no record of how they got through that winter, not because nothing happened, but because the people living it didn't control the written record. What exists are fragments. Ration records from 1816 and 1817 show reductions in the standard allotments of cornmeal and salt pork that form the foundation of the enslaved community's diet. What replaced those missing rations isn't documented. The small kitchen gardens that enslaved families tended on their own time, before dawn, after dark, produced less in the cold summer of 1816 than they had in any year anyone could remember. From scattered evidence, some families supplemented their food by fishing the nearby streams, hunting small game in the surrounding woods, gathering wild plants from the field margins. They did what they'd always done within the plantation system. They found ways to survive inside constraints they had no ability to change. Across New England, the communities that came through the winter of 1816 to 1817 with the fewest losses were the ones that had built networks of mutual support before the crisis arrived. Not formal institutions, just the quiet, informal webs of obligation and trust that form naturally in close-knit places over many years. A family that had shared seed corn with a struggling neighbour 2 seasons back had a relationship to lean on now. A man who'd helped fix a fence, or carried a meal during illness, or watched over a neighbour's animals while they were away. That man had credit in a system of exchange that didn't involve money and didn't require a bank. Communities with those deep roots of reciprocity lost fewer people to hunger that winter than places that had been less connected. But even the strongest community has its limits. When everyone's stores are gone, sharing nothing left produces the same outcome as sharing something. The towns that fared best were also the ones with access to outside markets, to imported food that could be bought at high prices or traded for if you still had anything worth trading. In coastal New England, towns served by shipping, food brought in from the south and from abroad was available. The families who could afford it ate. The ones who couldn't faced choices that grew harder with each passing week, and the children. The historical accounts handle this part gently, with the kind of careful distance that only time allows. The children of families that ran out of food that winter experienced malnutrition in the precise clinical sense. Reduced calories, protein deficiency, vitamin scarcity. All of it happening during developmental stages when those deficiencies cause damage that doesn't show up immediately, but surfaces later in stunted growth, in weakened immunity, in ways that quietly follow a person for life. We can't count those children. We can't trace exactly what that winter cost the specific small bodies that lived through it. But we know that early malnutrition leaves lasting marks, and the year without a summer touched the childhood of an entire American generation in ways the historical record is simply too thin to fully see. Some families didn't wait for winter to decide things for them. By October 1816, the wagons were already moving. Families who'd run the numbers in September and understood what they showed. That the thin harvest wouldn't last the cold, that the debts they couldn't service would bring creditors by spring, that fields that had failed 3 separate plantings would likely fail again. Those families loaded what they could carry and pointed themselves west. They were leaving behind what they'd built, moving towards something that was only just beginning to exist. And they were doing it in the early cold of a fall that arrived ahead of schedule, driving wagons through mud, looking back at farms they'd worked for years and were now walking away from, because the summer that was supposed to sustain them had simply vanished. Where were they going? And what were they building when they finally got there? Because the migration the year without a summer set in motion didn't just move people from one place to another, it quietly remade the map of America, and that reshaping is still visible today in places most people would never think to look. In a laboratory at Harvard University, scientists have been quietly working on a plan to recreate what Mount Tambora did by accident in 1815. Not the eruption itself, not the fire, the pyroclastic flows, the 71,000 dead. What they want to recreate is the atmospheric effect, the stratospheric aerosol veil. That thin layer of sulfuric acid particles that reduced incoming solar radiation across the northern hemisphere and dropped global average temperatures by as much as a full degree for 2 consecutive years. The effect that turned the summer of 1816 into the year that wasn't, that destroyed crops across 2 hemispheres, triggered mass migration, contributed to cholera outbreaks, and fell on people who had absolutely no idea what was happening to them or why. The Harvard project is called the Stratospheric Controlled Perturbation Experiment, SCOPEX. The underlying approach is known as stratospheric aerosol injection. The idea is relatively straightforward. Fly specially equipped aircraft to altitudes above 60,000 feet and release particles, sulfur dioxide, calcium carbonate, other compounds, into the stratosphere, where they'll form the same kind of reflective veil that Tambora's eruption accidentally created. The veil reduces incoming solar radiation. Surface temperatures fall. Crops withering in record heat get a chance to recover. Ice sheets accelerating toward collapse begin to slow. A cooled planet, purchased deliberately, maintained through regular injections at appropriate intervals. The farmers of Vermont in 1816 would have found this idea completely unthinkable, not because they didn't understand the desire to control weather, which has been a human wish as old as agriculture itself, but because the specific mechanism would have required a framework of understanding that simply didn't exist in their time. They had no concept of stratospheric chemistry. They had no instruments capable of measuring temperatures at altitude. They couldn't have described the layer of atmosphere we call the stratosphere today, let alone considered altering it. But here's the connection worth sitting with. The people of 1816 didn't choose to have sulfuric acid particles in the air above them. They didn't know the particles were there. They had no warning, no say, no recourse, no way of knowing what had been done to their sky. Tambora made that choice for them, or rather Tambora didn't make any choice at all because volcanoes don't choose, they simply erupt. And the consequences fell on people who'd never heard of Tambora, who couldn't have placed Sumbawa on a map, and who went to their graves never knowing why the summer of 1816 had abandoned them. The people who might one day live under an intentional aerosol program are in a structurally similar position, with one important difference. In their case, there would be people making the decision. People who could be identified, people who could be held accountable, and people living in parts of the world that would carry consequences they never voted for. Because here's what the scientists who take solar geoengineering seriously, and there are serious, credentialed people at serious institutions who do take it seriously, here's what they know about the risks. The aerosol veil doesn't spread its effects evenly. Tambora's veil shifted monsoon patterns across Asia, disrupted rainfall in ways that harmed some regions while perhaps benefiting others. An intentional injection program would carry the same uneven geography. A nation that cools the planet to protect its own coastline and food supply might, in doing so, shift monsoon timing in South Asia or alter rainfall across sub-Saharan Africa. The country that benefits most from the intervention, and the country that pays the steepest price for it, could easily be 2 entirely different places, different governments, different populations, different positions at any negotiating table. And then there's what researchers call the termination shock problem. What strikes me most about this is how quietly devastating it is, because Tambura's veil faded gradually over 2 or 3 years as particles slowly settled out of the stratosphere and temperatures eased back in step with that slow removal. But if humans build an intentional injection program and then stop it abruptly, for any reason, political instability, funding collapse, international conflict, the aerosols settle out quickly, and all the warming that had been held back comes rushing back, not gradually, rapidly, in months, not years. If you've been suppressing that warming for a decade through regular injections, and you suddenly lose the ability to keep injecting, everything that was held under the surface comes back at once, into a world that adapted to cooled conditions and never prepared for a rapid reversal. In some projections, the termination shock could be more damaging than the original warming the program was designed to prevent. None of this has stopped researchers from pursuing the work. David Keith at Harvard and his colleagues have argued that the risks of not exploring solar geoengineering may be greater than the risks of careful, well-monitored research. The reasoning is direct. If agricultural systems are close to failing under rising temperatures, if the ice sheets are nearing the kind of tipping points that could raise sea levels by meters within decades, then an intervention that buys time, even one that's imperfect and contested and risky, might be worth examining seriously. The question isn't whether it would be flawless. The question is whether it would be better than doing nothing. The farmers of 1816 had no choice about what entered their atmosphere. They woke to a sky that had been altered by forces they couldn't perceive or comprehend, and they adapted as best they could. Or they didn't. The question at the centre of the Scopex debate and the broader conversation about solar geoengineering is this. If we could choose to alter the sky, under what conditions, by whose authority, at what risk, for whose benefit, and reversible on what timeline, would that ever be acceptable? The year without a summer gives that question a specific, grounded historical weight. We know what it looks like when the aerosol veil arrives uninvited. We have the accounts of Vermont farmers, Swiss famine survivors, and Thomas Jefferson recording cold temperatures in his garden book in June. We have the migration patterns, the price records, the literary output, and the political consequences. From 1816, we have a detailed, lived example of what happens to human civilization when solar radiation drops by 1 to 2% over an extended period, when the sky becomes something other than what people counted on and built their survival around. The scientists at Harvard aren't proposing a year without a summer. They're proposing something far more controlled, far more gradual, far more carefully observed than what Tambora accidentally produced. But the core mechanism is the same. Particles in the stratosphere, sunlight scattered, surface temperatures shifted, and the consequences for people in different parts of the world will be, as they were in 1816, distributed unevenly, according to no particular principle of fairness. The question that the farmers of 1816 would have asked if they'd understood any of this is the same question scientists and policymakers and ethicists are asking right now. Who gets to decide what the sky does? And who pays when the decision goes wrong? The year without a summer didn't answer that question. It just produced consequences. Consequences that echoed for decades in the populations of new Midwestern states, in the literary culture of the 19th century, in the disease history of 2 continents. It was a case study in planetary scale cause with no planetary scale accountability. Every consequence traceable, every responsible party untraceable, every person who suffered real, and no one to answer for any of it. That asymmetry is precisely what a deliberate geoengineering program would, for the first time in history, change, and that change carries more weight and more danger than the technical challenge it's meant to solve. The eruption of 1815 was a decision no one made, an event no one chose, and it reshaped the world for generations. The decisions being considered now in laboratories and conference rooms and international policy conversations are choices, and the world they shape will be ours to own. But before we get to what 1816 ultimately built, in the long run, across the decades, we need to understand the moment the crisis hit bottom. The summer was ending. The harvest was coming in, or rather wasn't, and the decisions people made in the fall of 1816 would quietly shape the next 100 years. What broke first, and what did it cost? September arrived in 1816 wearing October's face. The first killing frost came before August had even ended across northern New England. It was the kind of cold that blackens everything green overnight, leaving the fields looking like something had simply given up on them. By the first week of September, hard frosts were falling regularly from Vermont to western Massachusetts. By mid-month, they'd pushed south into areas that never saw that kind of cold until October. The growing season of 1816 was over. Whatever was still in the ground on the 1st of September, that was all there was going to be. And across the northeastern states, what was in the ground wasn't enough. The harvest of 1816 was thin in a way that's hard to put into numbers. Record-keeping back then was local and uneven. But the price data tells the story. So do the surviving account books, and the diaries of farmers who are counting their stored food with quiet, growing dread. In Vermont, corn yields were a fraction of a normal season. Some counties saw near-total failure. 3 attempts at planting, 3 defeats, and nothing in the crib come harvest time. Wheat held up slightly better in places, but it was still well below what anyone needed. Hay was desperately short. The root cellars that should have been full by October were half empty or worse. The math of surviving a winter wasn't complicated, but it was relentless. A farm family in Vermont or New Hampshire needed a specific number of bushels, corn, potatoes, roots, dried goods, to make it through 6 months of cold. If they had half of that, they had 2 choices: buy the rest or eat less. Buying required cash, and there was no cash because there was nothing to sell. Cutting back on food, for people already eating at the lower edge of what kept a body going, meant choosing a slower kind of hunger. Neither choice was good. In many cases, neither was truly available. The storekeepers and merchants in small New England towns watched that fall unfold with a very particular kind of dread. They understood both sides of the problem at once. On one side, neighbours who needed to buy food on credit because their crops had failed, because they had nothing left to trade. On the other side, the merchants' own suppliers, also squeezed, also asking to be paid for everything extended in the spring. The storekeeper who gave credit generously risked losing his own business. The storekeeper who refused credit was watching his neighbours go hungry. There was no clean answer. This is what the year without a summer did to community after community. Not one dramatic moment, but a long grinding series of daily choices that slowly separated the families who made it from the ones who didn't. For many, the mortgage payment was the breaking point. Land in New England in 1816 was heavily mortgaged. The optimism of the post-war years had pushed families into purchases they could barely afford. Debt was common, and when the harvest failed and the cash didn't appear, those notes came due anyway. Banks and creditors hadn't been cruel when they extended those terms, but now they were facing their own financial pressure. They couldn't wait forever. Foreclosures began in the fall of 1816 and kept coming through 1817. Not a sudden wave, but a slow, steady erosion. Families were removed from farms they'd worked for years. The one asset that had defined their lives was gone. A family that lost its farm had few roads left. It could seek work in one of the early mills beginning to appear across New England. Places like Lowell, where factory wages were small but real, and where women and children from struggling rural homes could find at least something. It could move to a town and piece together a living from trade or labour, or it could go west. In 1816, the West began in western New York, still only partly cleared, and stretched through Ohio and Indiana and Illinois into country so lightly settled that the maps of it were more hope than fact. The federal government had been selling public land in those territories since the Land Ordinance of 1785. By 1816, the terms were actually within reach. 80 acres in Ohio or Indiana at $2 per acre, with 4 years to finish paying. The same land back in Vermont might cost 10 times that, and the soil wasn't as good. For a family in the fall of 1816, counting what was left in the root cellar, watching the mortgage clock tick, that arithmetic was hard to ignore. Better soil, lower prices, a growing season that behaved like a growing season, and letters from relatives who'd already made the move, writing back with real numbers, specific yields, specific acres, specific prices, making Ohio feel like a real place and not a rumour. The departures that autumn weren't dramatic. They were quiet and practical and heartbreaking in the specific way that real goodbyes always are. A wagon loaded with furniture and tools and seed corn and children wrapped in blankets, because even the September days were cold by then. A last walk around the place, the barn, the orchard, the garden, the field where 3 plantings had failed that year, the dog that couldn't make the trip, left with a neighbour, the sister who was staying because her husband wouldn't go, a handshake at the edge of the property, and then the wheels turning, and the farm slowly shrinking behind them. They moved west on roads that were barely roads, through a landscape still being carved out of wilderness, past towns managing their own harvest shortfalls, past other families doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same direction. The roads west in the fall of 1816 were crowded. In some accounts, the traffic backed up at river crossings, wagons waiting for ferry space, wheels sinking into mud after the rains. The slow emptying of New England had begun, and from close up it looked like a river of people, moving quietly through cold air, towards something that might be better. For some it was. The farms they built in Ohio and Indiana were better. Richer soil, more reliable seasons, stronger prospects. The families who survived the journey and the brutal first winters of new settlement and found land that actually grew what they planted. Those were the people who'd look back in old age and say that the worst year of their lives had pushed them exactly where they needed to go. For others it wasn't better. Some families arrived too late to plant that fall. They wintered in shelters that were barely shelters. They lost children and elders to the cold, and come spring, they found themselves facing the same debt they'd left behind, just in a different state. The Western migration wasn't salvation. It was a gamble made by people who'd run out of better options. But what all of them shared, the ones who stayed, and the ones who left, the ones who made it, and the ones who didn't, was the experience of a year that had broken something they'd always taken for granted. The belief that summer would come, the belief that the sky was something you could count on, the belief that the world you'd been handed was stable enough to plan around. Once that belief breaks, it doesn't simply reassemble itself when the next summer turns warm. Something stays broken. Something in the relationship between people and the land they depend on shifts permanently. And what America built on the other side of that shift, what came out of all that loss and movement and cold, is the part of the story that most people never hear at all. What did the catastrophe leave behind? And what did it cost America to find out? The summer of 1817 came back, not with any fanfare, not with apology, just quietly, steadily, the way something returns when it was never supposed to be gone. The frosts that had crept into New England through June and July and August of 1816 retreated on schedule in 1817. Corn planted in May grew without being cut down in the night. July turned warm, August turned hot, and by fall, the root cellars were filling again with the stores that the previous year had refused to give. For the families who'd stayed, who'd ground through that thin winter on short rations and borrowed time and sheer stubbornness, 1817 must have felt like being handed back something that was taken without reason. But the country that received that ordinary summer wasn't the same one that had entered 1816. The year without a summer had moved enough people that the map of the United States had quietly shifted. Not all at once, not in one dramatic wave, but in the slow, compounding way that migration always works. One family leaving, then another, then their neighbours, then the children of those neighbours, until the numbers tell you what you couldn't see watching any single wagon roll away. Vermont had a population of roughly 218,000 in 1810. By 1820, it counted 235,000. That's growth of just 8%, in a decade when the national population grew by more than 30. Vermont's numbers should have climbed faster. They didn't, because between 1816 and 1820, the state lost people to the west faster than new births could fill the gap. Some estimates put the number of Vermonters who left for western land at more than 10,000 in those 4 years alone. Certain hill counties never recovered. Some wouldn't return to their 1810 population levels until the 20th century. And the land those families left behind quietly went back to forest. The stone walls they'd cleared from their fields in the early 1800s still stand today, surrounded by trees that reclaim the cleared ground within a single generation. The walls are still there. The farms aren't. The year without a summer is written into Vermont's landscape in what's no longer there. The other New England states followed similar patterns, varying by county and coastline and economic option. But the overall picture holds. The cold, hungry year of 1816 pushed New England's most vulnerable farming families westward by at least a decade ahead of schedule. Families that might have held on another 5 years, trying one more planting, waiting one more season, instead made their decision in the fall of 1816, under the weight of failed crops and unpayable debt. The threshold was crossed earlier than it ever would have been otherwise, and wherever those families went, they brought New England with them. Ohio had nearly 600,000 residents by 1820, more than triple its population from a decade before. Indiana grew from 24,000 to 147,000 in that same span. Illinois, which had barely 12,000 people when it became a state in 1818, was adding settlers by the week. The towns these families founded, the churches they built, the schools they organized, all of it carried the cultural patterns of where they'd come from. The congregational churches that appeared in Ohio towns through the 1810s and 1820s were New England churches, transplanted root and stem. Town meeting governance, common school systems, a particular set of values around land, civic duty, and community responsibility. These weren't just habits. They were New England, deposited into the Midwest by people who'd been driven there, in part by the cold of 1816. That cultural transplant matters for American political history in ways that still haven't fully settled. The abolitionist movement of the 1830s and 1840s was strongest precisely in the parts of the Midwest that New England emigrants had built: the Western Reserve of Ohio, the northern counties of Indiana, the settled stretches of Illinois. The anti-slavery politics that eventually gave rise to the Republican Party and to Abraham Lincoln's election drew deeply from the political character of those communities that owed their Midwestern existence, at least in part, to the agricultural failures that followed Tambora's eruption. The chain of causation from a volcano in Indonesia to the Emancipation Proclamation runs through 100 steps. But the chain is real. Back in New England itself, the political consequences were different but no less lasting. The departure of younger, more mobile residents left behind a population that was a little older, a little more settled, a little more drawn toward the textile towns that were growing along the rivers. The shift from an agricultural New England to an industrial one, already moving before 1816, got there faster because so many farm families had been scattered. The mill workers of Lowell in the 1820s included a significant number of women and children from farming households that the events of 1816 had broken apart. They hadn't come to the factories by choice. They'd come because the land stopped providing. Strangely, some of the most valuable things that came out of the year without a summer were agricultural. The catastrophic corn failure of 1816 forced serious thinking about the danger of depending too heavily on a single crop. New England farmers who stayed and survived were often the ones who diversified most aggressively afterward. Wool sheep were added in large numbers, orchards expanded, dairy operations grew. The annual grain harvest, which had proven so fragile, became a smaller part of the picture. By the 1820s, wool had become a genuine New England industry, partly because the cold of 1816 had taught a hard lesson about putting everything into one kind of seed. Sheep don't need a perfect summer the way corn does. They need pasture and care, but they hold up far better against a season that goes wrong. That wasn't just common sense. It was a lesson paid for with a year of hunger. The year also left behind a new seriousness about watching the sky. Living through a climate crisis that no one had predicted and no one could explain produced a practical argument for long-term weather observation. Jefferson's careful records at Monticello, temperature readings taken day after day for decades, suddenly looked less like a gentleman's hobby and more like exactly the kind of data a civilization needed. The felt urgency of the post-1816 generation, the need to understand what the atmosphere was actually doing over time. That desire eventually produced the US Signal Corps Weather Service in the 1870s, and in time, the National Weather Service itself. The roots of American meteorology run back, in part, to the cold summer that no one saw coming. But not everything that came out of 1816 was a lesson learned or a system improved. Some of it was simply loss. The families who didn't survive that first winter. The children whose growth was quietly stunted by a year of not enough food. The communities so hollowed out by people leaving that they never got their civic life back. The farms that passed to creditors and never returned to the hands that had built them. History isn't a machine that turns suffering into growth. Sometimes it just turns suffering into suffering. Still, the country that came out the other side of the year without a summer was changed in ways you can trace. More spread out, with the Midwest now filling in because of what 1816 had cost people back east. More cautious in its farming, at least in New England, where the lesson about relying too heavily on one crop had been paid for in full. More attentive to the weather, more willing to treat the atmosphere as something worth measuring and recording, and perhaps a little more humbled, a little more aware that the continent being settled held forces within it, and forces connected to it from across the world, that couldn't be predicted, controlled, or fully understood by even the sharpest minds of the age. Thomas Jefferson knew that feeling. He felt it in the temperature readings he took every morning through the summer of 1816. Those numbers that kept refusing to behave the way experience said they should. What did he make of it all, looking back from the far side of that terrible year? And what did the year without a summer ultimately cost him, beyond the crops, the money, and the cold mornings? The morning light at Monticello in the fall of 1817 looked different to Thomas Jefferson than it had a year before. It's a small thing, the quality of light at dawn, and Jefferson wasn't a man who allowed himself small pleasures without also tending to whatever work was in front of him. but he noticed it. Somewhere in the writing of that period, the light of 1817 was what it was supposed to be, warm and gold in the early hours, falling correctly across fields that were finally giving something back. After a year when the light had felt wrong, pale and cold and unconvincing, its return carried a relief that went beyond thought. For a man of Jefferson's age and experience and financial worry, that shift was felt in the body as much as the mind. The corn was in, the wheat had come through reasonably well, the gardens were full, the root cellar and smokehouse at Monticello were stocked to something close to adequate. His financial situation was still severe. It would stay that way until his death, and beyond it. Debt that eventually swallowed Monticello whole, forcing the sale of nearly everything he'd spent his life building. But the specific pressure of 1816, the extra weight of a failed harvest on a structure already close to breaking, had eased, and so he began to think about what had happened. Not with emotion, Jefferson processed almost nothing through feeling alone. He worked through difficult experience the way he worked through everything else, by turning it into inquiry. The year without a summer became, in the years that followed, a subject for research, for correspondence, for the kind of careful, patient reflection he brought to any problem that held his interest. He gathered accounts from other farmers and correspondents about the season of 1816. He compared his Monticello temperature records with readings from other places looking for patterns. He read what scientific correspondence he could find from European observers who'd noted the same extraordinary conditions. He couldn't have found the answer he was searching for. The scientific framework needed to interpret those readings simply didn't exist yet. But the effort itself, the insistence on data, on comparison, on treating systematically what most people were explaining in religious or folkloric terms, was part of something larger. It was part of the slow, steady building of empirical tradition in American science that Jefferson had devoted his life to promoting. His weather records, kept faithfully through the worst summer in American memory, became part of a growing body of evidence that scientists in the 20th century would eventually use to confirm and measure the effects of Tambora. He would have loved knowing that. He would have loved knowing that the numbers he wrote down on those cold mornings in 1816 eventually helped explain the cause of his own suffering. The changes that the year without a summer brought to American farming were uneven, but real. The move toward wool sheep in New England picked up speed through the 1820s. Partly from the lesson of 1816, partly from new markets opening in the growing textile mills nearby. Vermont's merino sheep population had been rising since the early 1800s. After 1816, it grew explosively. By 1840, Vermont had more than 1 million sheep, an almost hard-to-grasp density on a landscape that was simultaneously losing people to the west. The wool economy quietly filled the space the grain economy had left behind, and it proved more durable, more varied, and more connected to the industrial markets taking shape in New England cities. Dairy farming grew in similar fashion. Milk, cheese, and butter had always been part of the New England farm, but they became more central after 1816. A cow that gave milk through a cold summer was more dependable than a cornfield that froze in June. Not perfectly dependable. Cattle could suffer too, as the winter of 1816 and 1817 made clear, but more resilient. The agricultural shift that followed the year without a summer made New England farms less efficient in the narrow sense, and considerably more capable of surviving the seasons that went wrong. The changes in how Americans watch the weather may have mattered most of all, in the long run. Jefferson's records were exceptional, but they weren't alone. Dozens of other individuals across the northeastern states had been keeping similar observations before 1816. After that year, the number of serious weather observers increased noticeably. The experience had made plain, in a way nothing else could, that this kind of information had practical value most people hadn't fully appreciated before. The American Philosophical Society, of which Jefferson was a central figure, began more actively collecting and sharing weather observations in the years after 1816. Individual states started asking whether systematic recording of conditions ought to become a government function. The American Meteorological Society, founded in 1850, and the Federal Weather Service that followed in the 1870s, are, in a quiet way, institutional answers to what 1816 had taught. The atmosphere is a system that can be observed, partially understood, eventually predicted with improving accuracy. And that predictive capacity has enormous practical value for a civilization whose food supply depends on what the sky decides to do. Every National Weather Service forecast issued today, every hurricane warning, every agricultural advisory that helps a farmer decide when to plant has its roots in the post-1816 understanding that weather is worth studying seriously. Benjamin Silliman at Yale, Josiah Meigs at the General Land Office, the network of Smithsonian volunteer weather observers established in the 1840s. All of these efforts were built on the understanding, sharpened by 1816, that atmospheric observation needed to be simultaneous, systematic and spread across geography to mean anything scientifically. One thermometer in one location told you what was happening there. A network of readings from Maine to Georgia told you something about the atmosphere as a living, connected system. The year. Without a Summer taught that lesson in the hardest possible way. American science heard it. Jefferson's own transformation in the years after 1816 was quieter, more private. He kept farming, he kept writing letters. He designed and built the University of Virginia, the project that consumed most of his energy in the last decade of his life, an institution whose architecture he oversaw with the same careful attention he'd given to his temperature notebooks. In a sense, the university was his answer to what 1816 had revealed. A republic of farmers who couldn't understand the forces bearing down on their fields was a republic dangerously exposed to things it couldn't name. Education, systematic, scientific, rigorously grounded in evidence, was his response to that exposure. He couldn't fix the summer of 1816. But he could build an institution committed to producing the kind of minds that might someday understand what had happened and why. He died in 1826 on the 4th of July, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. A coincidence so striking that even historians who take nothing on faith have paused over it. He died in debt. Monticello and the people he'd enslaved there were sold to settle what he owed. The estate he'd spent his life shaping was scattered by creditors who had waited patiently through crop failures, cold summers, and years of careful financial manoeuvring that never quite caught up. The year without a summer hadn't broken him. It had added to a weight already close to unbearable. It had pulled one more good harvest off the ledger at the worst possible moment, but it hadn't changed who he was. He kept recording the temperature every morning until the mornings became too few to count. He kept observing, kept writing, kept believing that what he put down on paper would be useful to someone who came later and understood more. He was right about that. What he recorded through that terrible summer, numbers written twice daily in careful ink, in notebooks that survived him, became part of the evidence the next century used to understand what had taken place and why. The transformation the year without a summer produced in American science, in its farming, in its patterns of settlement, was real and lasting, and it was built, at least in part, on the foundation of one meticulous man who refused to stop looking at the thermometer even when the numbers made no sense. What does all of that add up to, taken as a lesson? Not in the easy sense, not as something simple to say at the end of a hard story, but as the specific, hard-won wisdom that only comes from a catastrophe of this particular kind, affecting this particular society at this particular moment in history. Because there is a lesson here. It isn't an obvious one. It took a long time to find. The hardest part of the year without a summer wasn't the hunger. It wasn't the cold. It wasn't the dead crops or the horses that didn't make it, or the thin winter on reduced rations, or the foreclosures, or even the leaving. The departure from everything a family had spent years building, forced out by conditions no one chose. All of those things were terrible. All of them left marks that lasted for years, for lifetimes. But the hardest part was the silence at the centre of all of it. The fact that none of it came with an explanation. When sickness moves through a community, it's frightening, but it has a face. People fall ill. You can see it happening. You can quarantine, nurse, pray in a specific direction. When a flood takes your farm, the cause is right in front of you. The water, the river, the rain that wouldn't stop. When fire takes your barn, you know exactly what happened. You can grieve it cleanly. You can rebuild. When drought dries your fields, you can look up at the sky. You know what's missing. You can name the thing that hurt you. In 1816, Americans couldn't name it. The corn failed in June and no one knew why. The thermometer read wrong every morning and there was no framework to explain those numbers. The warm season refused to come and the cause was completely out of reach. A mountain on an island in the Pacific that had erupted 14 months earlier, pushing particles into a layer of the atmosphere that no one in America even had a precise word for yet. The cause was invisible, inaccessible. It had happened in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map, in a year before the damage arrived, through a physical process that the best science of the era couldn't follow. This is the particular wisdom the year without a summer has to offer. A meditation on what it feels like to suffer from causes you cannot see. It's a more common experience than we tend to admit. We have a strong preference for disasters that make sense. Crises with faces, names, explanations we can point to. We're far more comfortable with suffering that has an identifiable source because something identifiable can be addressed, argued with, blamed, at least shaped into a story that holds together. An earthquake that kills thousands is devastating. But it's legible. The ground moved. That's why people died. The line between cause and outcome is direct and visible. What 1816 demonstrated, and what's been demonstrated again and again in the centuries since, is that the most disorienting crises are the ones where cause and consequence are so far apart that no one can connect them in real time. The sulfuric acid veil drifting through the upper atmosphere was physically real. It was, in principle, measurable, if you had the instruments and the knowledge. But it was invisible to every person it was affecting, and that invisibility went beyond the physical. It prevented people from knowing what they were actually dealing with. It forced them to build explanations that were wrong. It made it impossible to know whether any given response, replant, ration, move on, pray, was actually useful, or simply motion in the absence of understanding. The Vermont farmers of 1816 who decided that the cold summer was God's judgment on a wayward community weren't being unreasonable. Given what they knew, a divine explanation was as plausible as anything else. The farmers who believed the weather was responding to sunspot activity were working with a theory that had at least some grounding in observation. The farmers who decided they'd simply had a run of bad luck, and that the following year would be better, were engaging in a form of probability thinking that was historically correct. The next year was better. None of these people were foolish. None were inexperienced. They were careful, attentive observers who'd spent their lives watching the natural world as closely as they could, and they still couldn't see what was destroying them. The wisdom this history offers isn't comfort. It isn't the reassurance that things work out in the end, or that communities always rise together, or that human resolve can outlast almost anything. Those things may be true, they may even have been true in 1816, in certain places and at certain moments. But they're not the lesson this particular story carries. The lesson is about the gap between what we experience and what we understand, between the reality of a cause and our ability to reach it, between suffering and the knowledge that would allow us to respond to it with any real effect. That gap doesn't close, not fully, not even with centuries of advancing knowledge. The people of 1816 faced a version of it so wide that the source of their catastrophe was invisible to the sharpest scientific minds of their generation. Today, we can trace the chain from a distant eruption to a global temperature shift in ways that would have been unthinkable then. But new gaps keep appearing, new places where whatever is driving our suffering operates in a dimension we haven't learned to observe clearly yet. What the people of 1816 learned, in the only way that kind of lesson can truly be learned, through the body, through cold and hunger and calculations that had no good answer, is that the world is full of causes you can't see from where you're standing. The Indonesian volcano that ruined the Vermont harvest was real. The connection between the two was real. The consequences were undeniable, and none of it was visible from the field where you stood, with dead corn at your feet, in June. So what do you do with that? What's the practical response to understanding that your worst crises might come from places so remote from your daily experience that you have no way of anticipating them? You do what the best of the people of 1816 did. You don't let the invisibility of the cause paralyze you. You stay flexible in your assumptions about where harm might come from. Jefferson kept recording the temperature even when the readings made no sense, because he understood that data he couldn't yet explain might someday become data someone could. The farmers who diversified after 1816, who added sheep, expanded dairy, reduced their dependence on any single crop, were putting a practical philosophy into practice. If you can't know what's coming, don't bet everything on a single outcome. And the people who left, who looked at a sky they couldn't explain and a winter they couldn't survive and made the choice to go somewhere that might be different, they were doing something that looks, from the outside, like giving up. But it wasn't. It was a deeply rational response to conditions that staying couldn't fix. When the cause of your suffering is beyond your reach and your current position has become untenable, movement isn't surrender, it's adaptation. The ability to recognize the difference between a problem you can solve and one you can only leave, and to act on that recognition before it's too late, is its own kind of intelligence. The farmers of 1816 demonstrated it without ever giving it a name. The year without a summer doesn't teach us to be stoic. It doesn't tell us to trust that things will be taken care of, or that hardship builds character, or that people are at their best when times are worst. It teaches something more uncomfortable than any of those things, that the most powerful forces acting on our lives may be the ones we can't see at all, and that the right response to that fact isn't despair or denial, but a particular kind of humble, attentive, flexible engagement with uncertainty, the willingness to keep measuring even when the numbers make no sense, the willingness to change what you're growing when the season stops cooperating, the willingness to ask seriously and without defensiveness whether the explanation you've accepted might be entirely wrong. That's a difficult thing to hold on to. It's much easier to want causes that match their consequences, to want stories that make the suffering legible, to want the world to behave in ways that can be understood and anticipated. But 1816 shows us what happens when the story we need and the reality we're living in have almost nothing in common. And it shows us, in the quiet persistence of the people who found a way through it, what it actually looks like to keep functioning anyway. What did all of this, the suffering, the departure, the slow understanding of the cause, the changes it set in motion, mean for who Americans became? And what does the experience of the year without a summer reveal about something in the American character that was already there, waiting to be tested? There's a myth at the heart of how Americans understand themselves. It goes something like this. We are a people who were given a land, and we mastered it. The pioneers who cleared the forests, broke the soil, and planted the crops that fed a growing nation weren't just doing agricultural work. They were living out a story about human capacity, about the relationship between effort and reward, about the belief that if you worked hard enough, on good enough land, with enough determination, the earth would provide. It was a story with a particular American flavour, rooted in the version of Protestantism that shaped so much of New England's culture. The belief that discipline, labour, and moral seriousness would be repaid in tangible earthly terms. You plant, you tend, you harvest. The covenant between human effort and natural provision was the very foundation of the agricultural republic that Jefferson and his generation were trying to build. The year without a summer broke that covenant, not permanently, not in any way that anyone named out loud as a fundamental rupture in the national story, but it broke it practically, materially, in the specific bodies and specific bank accounts of specific families across the northeastern states, and it left a mark on the collective American mind that operated quietly, well below the surface of public discussion. Here is what 1816 proved, in the plainest possible terms. Effort was not enough. Correct farming practice, applied carefully and consistently by experienced hands on established land, could not produce a harvest if the sky refused to provide the warmth that a harvest requires. The most disciplined farmer in Vermont, replanting 3 times with the best seed available, managing every hour of labour, doing everything right, got the same result as the careless one with exhausted soil who'd given up in May. The cause didn't distinguish between them. The aerosol veil drifting through the upper atmosphere scattered light equally over the dedicated and the negligent, the debt-free and the mortgaged, the devout and the indifferent. This is an uncomfortable truth for a culture built on the deep belief that personal character and material outcome are connected, and it's part of why the year without a summer has stayed somewhat underrepresented in American historical memory, even as other disasters of similar scale have been thoroughly commemorated. The story it tells doesn't fit the preferred version. It doesn't reward the virtuous. It doesn't punish the careless. It demonstrates, with the cold indifference of a physical law, that some forces simply don't care what you did, how hard you tried, or what you deserved. The American response to that demonstration was, characteristically, to absorb it without quite acknowledging it, and to keep going, add more sheep, go west, build the University of Virginia, start measuring the weather more carefully. In the wreckage of 1816, the country found not a reason to question its belief in effort and agency, but a reason to apply that effort in more flexible, more resilient ways. This is a recognizable American instinct, the refusal to let a disaster become a philosophical crisis, the preference for practical adjustment over existential examination. And it isn't necessarily wrong. It's produced a society with genuine adaptive strength, real resilience in the face of disruption. But it also means the deeper lesson of 1816 never fully settled into the culture the way it perhaps should have. The lesson that some causes are invisible, that some forces are global, that the relationship between human effort and earthly outcome is shaped by systems so vast and so remote that individual virtue is essentially irrelevant to how they operate. That lesson was absorbed in practice but never quite spoken aloud, Americans in 1817 were grateful that the warm season had returned and ready to plant again. They weren't, on the whole, transformed in their fundamental assumptions about what the world owed them for their labour, which is, in a way, completely understandable. You can't plant fields and raise children while holding in constant awareness the stratospheric chemistry of a planet whose atmosphere you can't see and whose connection to your corn crop you have no way of tracing. Some degree of practical confidence in the covenant between effort and harvest is psychologically necessary for the work to get done at all. The farmer who plants with real conviction that the season will cooperate isn't being naive. He's being functional. He's doing what the work requires. There's also something specifically American in all of this. The mythology of the self-sufficient frontiersman, the man who needs nothing from the outside world, who creates his own reality through will and labour alone, was already being built in 1816 in real time by the very people who were simultaneously proving it incomplete. The year without a summer showed that self-sufficiency has a hard limit, and that limit is the atmosphere. You can be the most capable farmer in New England, the most experienced, the most prepared, the most resourced. You still can't grow corn if the sun won't warm the ground. The mythology survived anyway, because it was more useful than the truth, and because the truth was too large and too distant to argue with directly. But somewhere in the American identity, somewhere in the gap between the confidence we project and the awareness we quietly carry, there has always been the knowledge that something like 1816 is possible. Not that specific event, not Tambora in particular, but the category of event it represents. The catastrophe that arrives from outside the frame of anyone's experience, from a source no one knew to watch, through a mechanism no one fully grasped, falling without regard for the merit of those who bore the consequences. Every generation of Americans has faced its version of this. The Dust Bowl was partly natural, partly the result of farming practices that stripped the plains bare, but it was also driven by drought conditions operating on scales that the people who suffered them couldn't control or fully understand. The 2008 financial collapse was a catastrophe whose causes were so deeply buried in the complexity of the financial system that even the professionals who'd built that system couldn't trace the connections that turned a housing problem into a global emergency. The pandemic of 2020 was, for a country that believed in its own preparedness, a demonstration that some systems fail in ways that surprise even the people who designed them. In each case, the response has been recognisable. Absorb the shock, make practical adjustments, argue about who's to blame, keep going. It's not the worst response, it has real virtues. But the year without a summer suggests there's something valuable in pausing, really pausing, to sit with the fact that the cause was invisible, that it came from somewhere no one was watching, that it would have unfolded exactly the same way regardless of everything anyone did or failed to do. The families who left Vermont in the fall of 1816 didn't know what had happened to them. They knew it had happened. They loaded their wagons and pointed west toward a sky they hoped would behave differently, and they built in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois communities that are still standing. They carried with them, without a name for it, the knowledge that the sky could fail without warning, without reason, without regard for what they'd planted or how carefully they'd prepared. And they kept farming anyway, because there was nothing else to do, because the alternative to continuing wasn't rest or safety, it was simply worse. That's not a triumphant identity. It's not the master of the continent story. It's something quieter and more honest. The character of people who've learned that the world doesn't make promises and who've found a way to live and plant and build regardless. What does that mean for us now? Looking at what the year without a summer set in motion, and looking at what we know the future holds, in a world that's warming rather than cooling, but that's no less capable of producing catastrophe from causes we can see but haven't fully reckoned with. There's one last thing, one final dimension of the year. Without a summer that most people never reach, a connection between what happened in 1816 and what's being planned in laboratories right now. A connection that doesn't just echo the past, it mirrors it. And once you see that mirror clearly, the past looks different, and so does the present, and you can't easily put the two of them back in separate places again. There's something that should keep you up at night, and it's not the cold. Right now, in research facilities at Harvard, at Stanford, and at institutions across Europe and Asia, serious scientists with serious credentials are working on a plan to deliberately recreate what Mount Tambora did by accident in 1815. Not the eruption, the veil, the stratospheric layer of reflective particles that scattered sunlight back into space, dropped global temperatures by nearly a full degree, and turned the summer of 1816 into the year that never quite arrived. They want to manufacture that veil on purpose, to fly aircraft to the edge of the stratosphere and release particles that will circle the planet, reducing incoming solar radiation in carefully calculated amounts, cooling a world that's warming faster than any civilization in recorded history has had to adapt to. The name is clinical and doesn't quite capture what it means. Stratospheric aerosol injection. The idea is that we might need to buy time to slow the heating of the atmosphere while we build the energy systems and the agricultural adjustments and the sea defences that a warmer planet will eventually demand. To deliberately introduce a Tambora-like cooling effect, controlled, monitored, intended to be reversible, a bridge between the world we've made and the world we need to make. Think about what that means from where 1816 stood. The farmers of Vermont who watched their corn freeze in June of that year had no idea they were living through the distant effects of something that had happened on the other side of the planet. They had no framework for understanding that the quality of the summer light, the temperature drifting over their fields, the survival or death of their crops, was being shaped by invisible particles in a layer of the atmosphere they had no name for. They were completely in the dark about the mechanism that was destroying them. They suffered without understanding. They adapted without knowing what they were adapting to. They moved west toward whatever they hoped might be better, pushed by a force they couldn't identify. The people who would live in a world where stratospheric aerosol injection was actively being practiced would stand in a structurally different place. They would know what was up there. They would know who put it there. They would know, in principle, why the decision was made, what the intended effect was, and what the risks of stopping would be. The mechanism wouldn't be hidden. The cause wouldn't be unknowable. The link between particles in the upper atmosphere and the temperature over their fields would be available in government reports, scientific papers, and news coverage. But who would make that decision? Under what authority? With what consent from the billions of people whose lives would be affected? The people across South Asia who depend on monsoon rains that an aerosol veil might shift. The communities in sub-Saharan Africa whose food security is tied to rainfall patterns a cooled atmosphere might alter. The people in the Arctic watching their ice fail, who might or might not benefit from a carefully calibrated drop in temperature. The power to alter what the sky does to the entire planet, to decide for everyone alive what the summer is going to be. That's a kind of power that has never before existed in human hands. It would make any government that chose to use it unilaterally into something like a planetary weather authority, imposing its calculations on every human being on Earth, without election, without consent, without any meaningful recourse. The farmers of 1816 were subject to a power like that, but it was a blind power. A volcano has no intentions, no political agenda, no theory of justice. It erupted because of pressure and geology and chance. The consequences fell on whoever was in the way. The sulfuric acid particles that scattered the light of that summer over Vermont and Virginia and France and China didn't choose their targets. They simply circulated. The power being considered by researchers working on solar geoengineering is not blind. It has intentions, theories, funding sources, institutional authors who can be named and held accountable. That shift from the indifferent mechanism of a volcano to the deliberate choices of identifiable human beings changes the entire ethical character of the situation. It doesn't make stratospheric intervention obviously wrong. Some of the scientists who take it most seriously are driven by a genuine desire to prevent suffering on a scale that would dwarf what 1816 produced. But it changes the question from what happened to us to what are we doing? And that change carries with it every difficulty, every responsibility that human choice has ever carried. Thomas Jefferson took the temperature every morning in the summer of 1816 because he believed that careful observation and faithful record-keeping was the most useful thing he could do when the world stopped making sense. He was right. The data he wrote down on those cold mornings became part of the evidence that a later generation used to understand what had actually taken place. He couldn't fix the summer. He couldn't explain it. But he could pay attention to it, seriously and steadily, and he did. We're in a different position now. We have the data. We have, roughly speaking, the explanation. We know about tambera and stratospheric aerosols and global temperature dynamics, one in ways that would have seemed extraordinary to Jefferson. We can trace the chain from a volcanic eruption on a Pacific island to a frost on a Vermont cornfield in June. We can see what he couldn't, what we're still struggling to see, what might be, for our generation, the invisible cause that future people will look back on and wonder how we missed, is the full consequence of the choices we're now beginning to make about the atmosphere. Not just the consequences of warming it, which are being argued everywhere, loudly and with growing urgency, but the consequences of intentionally cooling it, of introducing a new human-made particle layer into a stratosphere that already holds our emissions, our damage to its ozone, our modifications to its chemistry in dozens of ways that are only partially understood. There are people alive right now, in low-lying coastal communities in Bangladesh, in subsistence farming villages across the Sahel, in Pacific Island nations watching their freshwater tables turn salt. For them, the policy debate about stratospheric aerosol injection is not abstract at all. The monsoon that arrives too late, or not at all, is a crop failure. The crop failure is a family crisis. The family crisis is a decision about whether to stay or go. The chain from particle density in the stratosphere to a specific family loading a specific wagon on a specific morning runs through fewer steps than the people discussing the policy tend to think. The farmers of Vermont in 1816 never had a chance to participate in a decision that ruined their harvest. The question being posed right now in the most consequential conversations of this century is whether we are going to build a world where that kind of exclusion is still possible, or whether we'll finally insist that the people most affected by a decision about the sky must be the people most central to making it. The year without a summer happened because one system, the volcanic pressure that had been building beneath Tambora for years, reached a threshold and released. The force propagated through the global atmosphere, and it fell on people who had no idea it was coming. The next planetary atmospheric event may not be accidental. And in a laboratory at Harvard, someone is measuring particles right now, calibrating, observing, writing down numbers, the way Jefferson wrote down the temperature on cold June mornings in 1816, trying to understand something enormous that is still, in the ways that matter most, larger than the understanding of anyone in the room. The summer of 1816 never explained itself to the people who lived through it. It just ended. The next summer came. People planted again. The crops grew. The children who hadn't starved ate. The country kept moving forward, and the cause that nobody could see slowly settled out of the stratosphere and was gone. The question we don't yet know how to answer is whether the next time the sky changes, deliberately with human hands doing the changing, with institutions and governments and competing national interests standing behind those hands, we will have become wise enough to understand what we're doing before we've already done it. Thank you for watching Bedtime Sleepy. Drift gently into sleep and I'll see you in the next story.